What would you do if a hero who risked everything for your freedom was thrown out of a bar for no reason? On a chilly Tuesday evening in the coastal town of Bayview, a shocking scene unfolded that would change one man's life and one bar forever. Daniel "Danny" Harper, a recently discharged Navy SEAL, sat quietly with his untouched lager, the dim light of the rusty anchor casting shadows across his weathered face. He was a man who'd faced enemy fire without flinching. Yet when the bar owner, a gruff man named Tony Marino, barked, "You don't belong here. Too disruptive. Get out." Danny froze, his calm voice barely a whisper. "Disruptive? I haven't even spoken." But Tony wasn't listening. He pointed to the door, his sneer cutting deeper than any blade, a cruel dismissal that struck at the heart of a veteran seeking peace. The next day, as Tony unlocked his bar for the afternoon rush, a low rumble echoed down the street, a sound that sent a shiver through the salty air. 12 figures, each one a mirror of Danny's quiet intensity, stepped out of 3 black vans, their boots hitting the pavement with purpose. They weren't here for a drink. They were here for justice. If you've ever felt the sting of unfairness or admired the unbreakable loyalty of those who serve, this story will resonate deeply. Let's honor our veterans' sacrifices. Type "honor" in the comments to show your gratitude for their courage. And if you love stories that celebrate the strength of brotherhood, subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories as we aim for 1,000 subscribers to keep sharing these touching tales of resilience and redemption. Danny Harper had spent 18 years as a Navy SEAL, a career that began when he was just 20, fresh out of a small-town high school with dreams bigger than the endless cornfields of his childhood. He joined the SEALs not for glory, but for purpose, a way to channel his restless energy into something that mattered, something bigger than himself. His years in the service were a grueling tapestry of covert missions across scorching deserts in Iraq, where the sun baked his skin through his gear until it blistered, and icy mountains in Afghanistan, where the thin air burned his lungs with every ragged breath. Each mission tested his resolve, from midnight raids that left his heart pounding in his chest to long, silent stakeouts where the only sound was the rustle of his own thoughts, a quiet that could be as deadly as any bullet. The bonds he'd forged with his team were stronger than steel, woven through shared danger and unspoken trust. They weren't just teammates, they were family, the kind of family that didn't need words to understand the weight of a glance or the grip of a handshake. One memory stood out, a night in the Afghan mountains that Danny couldn't shake, a moment that haunted him even now in the stillness of civilian life. His team had been pinned down by enemy fire, the crack of bullets echoing off the jagged cliffs as they took cover behind a crumbling stone wall. They were outnumbered, low on ammo, and the extraction chopper was still 40 minutes out, an eternity in a firefight. Danny's shoulder ached from a near miss, a graze that left a scar he still carried. But the real pain was the fear in his team's eyes, a fear he'd never seen before in men he'd trusted with his life. That's when Chief Ethan Hawk Maddox, his team leader, pulled out a crumpled photo of his daughter, a gap-toothed girl named Emily, grinning in a sunflower field, her yellow dress bright against the golden petals. "She's waiting for me," Hawk had said, his voice steady despite the chaos, a beacon of calm in the storm. "We're getting out of this." That photo became their anchor, a reminder of what they were fighting for, a thread of hope in a moment of despair. They made it out that night, their boots kicking up dust as they sprinted to the chopper, but the memory lingered, a bittersweet ache that hit Danny hardest now. He'd fought for a future he wasn't sure he could live in, and the weight of that realization was heavier than any rucksack he'd ever carried. After a shrapnel wound from his final mission tore through his shoulder, leaving him with limited mobility and a constant ache, Danny was honorably discharged. The silence of civilian life felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the constant adrenaline of his past, a world where every second could be your last. He dreamed of returning to a world that made sense, a place where honor and sacrifice were understood, but instead he found himself adrift, the rhythm of his days replaced by an unsettling stillness that gnawed at him. Bayview's salty air was supposed to heal him, a recommendation from a therapist he'd seen exactly twice before deciding he'd rather face his demons alone. At 38, Danny rented a cramped attic above a bait shop. The creak of the floorboards a constant reminder of his displacement. The room smelled of mildew and fish, a damp, briny scent that clung to everything, and the single window offered a sliver of a view, a gray ocean that stretched endlessly, mirroring the uncertainty in his heart. He'd lie awake at night, the hum of the harbor outside his window a poor substitute for the camaraderie of his team, their laughter, their shared silences. The walls of his attic seemed to close in, the peeling paint a map of his own fractured thoughts, and he traced the scar on his shoulder with his fingers, a jagged line that told a story he wasn't sure he wanted to remember. Danny wasn't the Hollywood SEAL stereotype. No bulging muscles or cocky grin to announce his past. He was lean, with piercing hazel eyes that missed nothing, his sandy hair clipped short under a faded navy cap he'd worn since his first deployment, a relic of a life he couldn't let go. In jeans and a plain gray tee, he blended in, but his quiet energy often unnerved strangers who mistook his vigilance for arrogance. He walked with a slight limp now, a remnant of his injury, but his posture remained rigid, a soldier's habit he couldn't shake, a reminder of the discipline that had kept him alive. Danny craved normalcy, a moment to breathe without the weight of his past pressing down on him, a chance to feel human again. He'd heard about the Rusty Anchor from a local fisherman while buying coffee at the pier, a weathered bar by the water, known for its live bands on Fridays and a decent fish fry that drew a small crowd. On this Tuesday night, the place was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that felt both comforting and oppressive, a stillness that reminded him too much of the moments before an ambush. Just a handful of locals sat scattered across the room, nursing their drinks, their conversations a low murmur against the clink of glasses, a sound that felt distant, like a memory he couldn't quite place. The air was thick with the scent of fried fish and stale beer, the wooden floor sticky under Danny's boots as he made his way to a corner table, the worn wood creaking under his weight. He ordered a lager, the glass cold against his palm, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the bar, and let his eyes drift to the faded maritime maps on the wall, their curling edges yellowed with age, the ink blurred by time. It was a habit from years of scanning for threats, assessing exits, noting faces, calculating risks, even in a place as mundane as a waterfront bar. The Rusty Anchor wasn't much to look at. Peeling paint on the walls, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years, its glass cracked like a spiderweb, and a neon sign above the bar that flickered weakly, casting a bluish glow over the bottles of cheap whiskey. But there was a certain charm to its roughness, a lived-in quality that Danny appreciated, a place where he could be invisible, if only for a moment. He sipped his lager slowly, the bitter taste grounding him, a tether to the present as his mind wandered to the future. What was next for a man like him? He'd thought about opening a small charter fishing business, using the ocean as a new battlefield, a way to reclaim some sense of purpose. But the idea felt distant, like a dream he wasn't sure he deserved, a hope that seemed to slip through his fingers like the sand on Bayview's beaches. He watched the other patrons, a grizzled old man at the bar, muttering to himself over a glass of bourbon. A couple by the window, their voices low but tense, their hands clasped too tightly. A lone woman in a red jacket, staring out at the pier as if waiting for someone who'd never come. Danny wondered what their stories were, if they carried burdens as heavy as his own, or if their lives were simpler, unmarred by the ghosts of war. Tony Marino, the Rusty Anchor's owner, was a burly man with a perpetual scowl etched into his weathered face, his jowls sagging like a bulldog's, his eyes small and mean, always searching for a fight. He ran his bar like a dictator, enforcing rules that shifted with his mood, his temper as unpredictable as a coastal storm that could turn the sea to froth in minutes. Tony had grown up in Bayview, the son of a fisherman who'd never made it big, a man who'd spent his life chasing a dream that always slipped away. Tony carried that bitterness like a badge, a chip on his shoulder that had grown into a boulder over the years. The Rusty Anchor was his kingdom, a place where he could feel powerful, even if that power was built on petty control, a fragile empire of sticky floors and cheap liquor. He kept a baseball bat behind the bar, not for protection, but for intimidation, and he wasn't above using it to make a point, his knuckles whitening around the handle whenever a patron dared to challenge him. Tony harbored a deep grudge against military types, a resentment born from a bar fight years ago involving some sailors. A minor incident he'd inflated into a personal vendetta that defined him. It had started over a spilled drink, a drunken argument that escalated into a scuffle, leaving Tony with a bruised ego and a broken chair, the splintered wood a symbol of his wounded pride. The sailors had been young, cocky, and loud, their laughter echoing through the bar as they stumbled out into the night, leaving Tony to clean up the mess. He'd never forgiven them, or any soldier since. To him, they were all the same, trouble, all swagger and violence, a threat to the respectable establishment he'd built, a place where he could pretend he was more than the son of a failed fisherman. He prided himself on keeping them out, often bragging to his regulars about the time he'd shown those punks who's boss. His chest puffed out like a rooster's, his voice loud enough to drown out the doubts that whispered in his mind. Tony had pegged Danny the moment he walked in, his eyes narrowing as he watched him from behind the bar. It wasn't the clothes or the drink. It was the way Danny moved, the way his eyes swept the room with a predator's focus, taking in every detail. The couple arguing in low tones by the window, their hands clenched in frustration. The bartender wiping down the counter with a stained rag, his movements slow and deliberate. The flickering exit sign above the door, its red glow a beacon in the dimness. Tony saw a threat, not a man seeking peace, a man whose very presence challenged the fragile control he clung to. He watched Danny for 25 minutes, his thick fingers drumming on the counter, his scowl deepening with every passing second, the tension building like a storm cloud ready to burst. Danny's lager sat barely touched, the condensation pooling on the table, a silent testament to his restraint, but Tony didn't see restraint. He saw danger. Finally, Tony decided to make his move, his heavy boots thudding against the floor as he stomped over, arms crossed, his voice a growl that cut through the bar's quiet hum like a knife. "You've been staring too long, buddy. You scoping the place out, or what?" His tone was accusatory, his eyes blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with Danny and everything to do with the ghosts of his own past. Danny blinked, caught off guard, his lager halfway to his lips, the cold glass a stark contrast to the heat of Tony's glare. "Just drinking my lager. Thinking," he said, his voice steady, but a flicker of unease stirred in his chest, a soldier's instinct telling him this wasn't going to end well, a warning that echoed in the back of his mind like a distant siren. Tony scoffed, his breath reeking of whiskey and bitterness, a sour smell that made Danny's nose wrinkle as Tony leaned closer, his bulk looming over the small table. "Thinking? I don't like your kind of thinking here. You're making my customers nervous." He gestured to the other patrons, who kept their heads down, pretending not to notice, their shoulders hunched as if they could feel the storm brewing, the air thick with unspoken tension. "My kind." Danny's tone remained calm, but his hazel eyes darkened with a warning glint, a storm cloud gathering behind them, a sign of the strength he kept tightly leashed. "What kind is that?" Tony leaned closer, his voice dripping with contempt, his meaty finger jabbing the air inches from Danny's face, a challenge that dared him to react. "The military kind, always looking for trouble, thinking you own the place. I've had enough of your type. You're too disruptive." Danny's jaw tightened, his fingers curling slightly around the glass, the cold seeping into his skin as he fought to keep his composure. Disruptive? He hadn't spoken to anyone but the bartender, hadn't moved from his seat, his presence as unobtrusive as the faded maps on the wall. The accusation was absurd, but the hostility in Tony's eyes was real, a fire that had been burning long before Danny walked through the door, a fire fueled by years of resentment and insecurity. "Doesn't matter," Tony snapped, his face reddening, veins bulging at his temples as his anger boiled over, his voice rising to a shout that made the other patrons flinch. "Finish your drink and get out. I run a clean place here." Danny set his glass down with deliberate precision, the cold condensation slick against his fingers, a stark contrast to the heat rising in his chest, a fire of his own that he struggled to contain. The unfairness burned in his gut, sharper than any battlefield wound, a raw, searing pain that made his breath catch, a wound that cut deeper than shrapnel. After all he'd sacrificed, nights without sleep, friends he'd buried, the screams of the wounded still echoing in his dreams. To be reduced to a stereotype by a small-minded bar owner was a bitter pill, one that tasted of ash and betrayal. He thought of Hawk, of that night in Afghanistan, of the promises they'd made to always have each other's backs, a vow that had kept them alive through the darkest moments. Where was that honor now, in a world that judged him for the very thing that had defined his life, a world that saw him as a threat rather than a protector? "I'm a paying customer," Danny said, his voice low but edged with steel, the kind of steel that had carried him through firefights and interrogations, a strength that Tony couldn't begin to understand. "I have the right to finish my drink in peace." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge, a plea for fairness in a place that had none to offer. Tony's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he hesitated, sensing the danger in Danny's calm, the coiled energy of a man who'd faced worse than a bar owner's tantrum, a man who'd stared down death and walked away. But his pride overruled his instincts, a lifetime of insecurity driving him to assert his dominance, to prove he was the king of this small, grimy kingdom. He slammed a meaty hand on the table, the thud echoing like a gunshot, the glass wobbling precariously, a droplet of lager spilling onto the scarred wood. "You're wrong, pal. My bar, my rules. Get out now, or my bouncer and I will drag you out," he growled, his voice a snarl that filled the room, a threat that hung heavy in the air. He jerked a thumb toward a hulking figure behind the bar, a man named Bruno, whose scarred knuckles and crooked nose suggested he enjoyed his job a little too much, a man who'd broken more than a few bones in Tony's name. Bruno cracked his knuckles, a slow, deliberate sound that sent a shiver through the room, his lips curling into a smirk that promised violence, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. The other patrons glanced over, their curiosity outweighing their fear, but no one moved to intervene, their silence a testament to Tony's reign, a reign built on fear rather than respect. Danny's gaze flicked from Tony to Bruno, then back again, his mind racing through scenarios as if he were back in a war zone, his training kicking in like muscle memory. He could take them both, he knew it. Years of training made it a certainty. A quick jab to Tony's throat to stun him, a sidestep to avoid Bruno's lumbering swing, a takedown that would leave them both on the floor before they knew what hit them, their pride shattered along with their bones. But what would it prove? A brawl, police, a mess he didn't need while trying to start over, a stain on the new life he was trying to build. He'd come to Bayview to escape that violence, not to bring it with him, to find peace, not to wage another war. The resignation settled over him like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating, a reminder of how far he was from the world he'd known, a world where honor meant something. This was civilian life, unfair, petty, and indifferent, a place where sacrifice was met with scorn, where heroes were cast aside like yesterday's news. He stood slowly, pushing his chair in with a soft scrape, the sound barely audible over the pounding of his own heart, a rhythm that echoed the drumbeat of his past. "Keep the change," he muttered, leaving his nearly full lager behind, the amber liquid catching the dim light as he turned away, a silent testament to his restraint. Tony and Bruno smirked as he walked to the door, their victory hollow but satisfying, their laughter following him like a taunt, a cruel echo that lingered in the air. "Don't come back," Tony shouted, his voice dripping with triumph, a king asserting his dominance over a kingdom of broken dreams. Danny stepped into the night, the cool air hitting him like a slap, the scent of salt and seaweed grounding him as the injustice coiled tighter in his chest, a serpent that refused to let go, its fangs sinking deeper with every step. He walked a few blocks, his boots scuffing against the uneven pavement, the sound a lonely rhythm in the quiet night, until he reached the pier, where he leaned against a weathered railing, the wood rough under his palms, splintered from years of salt and wind. The dark waves whispered below, their rhythm steady but cold, a song of indifference that mirrored the ache in his heart. For a moment, he let himself feel the weight of it all. The loneliness, the disconnection, the ache of a life left behind, a life he wasn't sure he could ever reclaim. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting second, he was back in Afghanistan. The smell of gunpowder in the air, Hawk's voice in his ear, the warmth of his team around him, a warmth that had kept him alive through the coldest nights. But the memory faded, leaving him alone with the sound of the tide and the bitter taste of rejection, a taste that lingered on his tongue like ash. Danny pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the raw emotion he'd kept buried for too long, a dam threatening to break. He opened a secure app his team still used, a relic of their days together, a lifeline to the only family he'd ever truly known. He typed a brief message to Hawk Maddox, his fingers moving with the precision of a soldier. Rusty Anchor, Bayview. Owner Tony Marino, hostile to military, ejected me for no reason. Just an FYI. Danny. He hit send, not expecting a reply, not expecting anything at all. It was just a way to vent, to share the sting of rejection with the only people who'd understand, a small act of defiance in a world that had turned its back on him. The next day, around 2:45 p.m., Tony was unlocking the Rusty Anchor, a smug grin on his face as he bragged to his bartender, a wiry man named Sal, about keeping the riffraff out. Told that guy where he could shove his attitude, Tony said, chuckling as he adjusted the bar's open sign, the glass smudged with fingerprints, a testament to his neglect. He'd already forgotten Danny, convinced he'd won, his ego inflated by the memory of his own bravado, a false victory that made him feel untouchable. Sal nodded absently, wiping down the counter with a stained rag, but his eyes flicked nervously to the street outside, as if he could sense the shift in the air, a storm brewing on the horizon. Across the street, 3 black vans rolled to a stop with eerie precision, their engines humming like a predator's growl, a sound that sent a chill down Sal's spine, a warning he couldn't ignore. Tony glanced over, his grin faltering, his hand pausing on the door, the metal cold against his sweaty palm. These weren't delivery vans, not with the way they parked, each one perfectly aligned, their tinted windows reflecting the overcast sky, a mirror of the tension that hung heavy in the air. The doors slid open, and out stepped 12 men, each one a towering figure of quiet power, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine, a unit that moved as one. They wore civilian clothes, jeans, tees, and caps, but there was nothing civilian about their bearing, the way they carried themselves with a purpose that made the air feel heavier, a weight that pressed down on Tony's chest. Hawk Maddox led them, his steely blue eyes locked on the bar, his jaw set in a line that promised reckoning, a leader who'd seen hell and walked out the other side. At 42, Hawk was a legend among the SEALs, a man who'd led his team through missions that most wouldn't survive, his leadership as unyielding as the cliffs they'd once scaled under enemy fire. The others fanned out behind him, their presence a silent storm, each man a mirror of Danny's quiet intensity. Bear, a giant with a shaved head and a scar across his cheek, a mark from a knife fight he'd never talk about. Doc, the team medic, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting in the pale light. And 10 others, each one a testament to the brotherhood Danny had left behind, a family that had come to reclaim one of their own. They crossed the street in a loose formation, their boots silent on the pavement, their focus absolute, a force that seemed to bend the world around them. Tony froze in the doorway, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple, his earlier confidence evaporating like mist in the sun, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He recognized the look in their eyes, the same restrained intensity he'd seen in Danny, now multiplied by 12, a force that made his knees weak, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. Hawk stopped inches from Tony, the team forming a semicircle that blocked the entrance entirely, their shadows stretching long across the bar's threshold, a wall of judgment that left Tony nowhere to hide. Can I help you, gentlemen?" Tony stammered, his voice cracking, the words barely audible over the pounding of his own heart, a sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. Hawk let the silence stretch, each second heavier than the last, a tactic he'd used in interrogations to break men far stronger than Tony, a silence that spoke louder than any shout. The bar's neon sign buzzed overhead, the sound grating in the stillness, a discordant note in the symphony of tension, and Tony's hands trembled as he clutched the doorframe, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Tony Marino?" Hawk finally asked, his voice a low rumble, carrying the weight of a man who'd led teams through hell, a man who didn't ask twice, a man whose authority was as unyielding as the ocean itself. Tony nodded weakly, his throat dry, his earlier bluster gone, replaced by a fear that clawed at his chest, a fear he hadn't felt since he was a boy, cowering from his father's wrath. "We understand you had an issue last night with one of our brothers, Daniel Harper," Hawk continued, his tone calm, but laced with an authority that made Tony flinch, his words a blade that cut through the last of Tony's defenses. Tony's eyes darted between the men, his hands trembling, his mind racing for an escape that didn't exist, a way out of the trap he'd walked into. "It was a misunderstanding. I just asked him to leave." "No harm done," he said, his voice a squeak, a pitiful attempt at defiance. But the words fell flat in the face of the SEAL's unwavering gaze, a gaze that saw through him, stripping away every layer of bravado until he was nothing but a scared little man in a big man's body. Bear let out a low, menacing chuckle, the sound like gravel underfoot, a warning that made Tony's stomach lurch, a sound that promised consequences Tony couldn't imagine. Hawk raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable but piercing, his blue eyes like ice, cutting through Tony's excuses with surgical precision. "Nilkhadim, you insulted him. You threatened him. You kicked him out based on your own ignorance. Is that how you treat a man who's bled for this country?" The words were a blade, cutting through Tony's defenses, exposing the cowardice beneath his bravado, a truth he couldn't hide from, no matter how hard he tried. Tony wiped his brow, desperation creeping in, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat, the fabric damp and heavy against his skin. "I support the troops. I've got a flag out front." His voice cracked, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears, a desperate plea that fell on deaf ears. Hawk's expression didn't soften, his eyes narrowing slightly, a predator sizing up its prey, a man who'd seen through lies far more convincing than Tony's. "A flag means nothing if you disrespect the men who fought for it. We're going to hold a team meeting here, maybe spend a few hours, a few rounds. But after Danny's experience, we're reconsidering," Hawk said, his voice steady, each word a hammer striking Tony's fragile ego, shattering it into pieces. Tony's mind raced. 12 SEALs meant big money, a chance to turn a slow afternoon into a profitable one, a lifeline for a bar that was always one bad month away from closing. But the look in Hawk's eyes told him this wasn't about profit, not by a long shot, and the realization made his stomach drop, a cold dread settling in his bones. "Look, if I messed up, I'm sorry, to Danny, to all of you. First round's on me." Tony's forced smile was pathetic, his lips trembling as he tried to salvage the situation, his voice high and strained, a plea for mercy he didn't deserve. Hawk stepped closer, his voice colder, each word a hammer striking Tony's fragile ego, a final blow to the man Tony thought he was. "An apology to us doesn't fix this, Marino. You disrespected Danny, and through him, every veteran who's sacrificed more than you'll ever understand. Here's what you'll do," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, a command that brooked no defiance. Hawk outlined his demands with the precision of a military briefing. Tony would find Danny, apologize sincerely, and welcome him back as an honored guest, a gesture of respect that would set things right. Then, he'd make a public donation to the Navy SEAL Foundation in Danny's name, a gesture that would show the town and the SEALs that he understood the gravity of his actions, a penance for his sins. Tony blanched at the mention of a donation, his face paling as if Hawk had asked for his firstborn, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. "How much are we talking?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, a plea for mercy that Hawk ignored. Hawk nodded to Doc, the team's medic and numbers man, a lean man with wire-rimmed glasses and a mind sharper than any blade, a man who could calculate the cost of a man's pride as easily as he could stitch a wound. "My associate will discuss that with you. And from now on, this bar will be a place that honors veterans. Not just with a flag, but with respect." Hawk said, his words a promise, a warning, a new law that Tony had no choice but to obey. Tony, thoroughly humbled, could only nod, his shoulders slumping in defeat, the fight drained out of him like water from a cracked bucket, leaving him empty and broken. For the next hour, the rusty anchor became a silent battlefield, the tension thicker than the fog that often rolled in off the bay, a fog that seemed to seep into the bar itself, cloaking everything in a gray haze. Doc sat Tony down in his dingy office, a cramped space that smelled of stale cigarettes and regret, the walls stained with years of neglect, negotiating a donation that left Tony pale, his hands shaking as he scribbled figures on a notepad, each number a nail in the coffin of his pride. The rest of the team occupied the bar, their presence a quiet but undeniable statement, their silence louder than any shout, a testament to their unity, their loyalty. They sat at various tables, their postures relaxed but their eyes sharp, watching everything. The nervous twitch of Sal's hands as he polished glasses, his movements jerky and unsteady. The way the few regulars who wandered and took one look and turned back around, their steps quickening as they fled the oppressive atmosphere. The creak of the floorboards under their own weight, a sound that seemed to echo the weight of their mission. This wasn't about drinking or causing trouble. It was about justice, about making sure Danny's honor was restored, and that Tony understood the cost of his prejudice, a lesson he'd never forget. Tony emerged from his office, his hands shaking as he dialed Danny's number, his fingers fumbling over the buttons, his breath hitching in his throat. In a trembling voice, he apologized, the words spilling out in a rush, a desperate plea for forgiveness as he invited Danny back as an honored guest, a man humbled by the weight of his own mistakes. Danny, sitting on his creaky attic bed, the springs groaning under his weight, accepted with the same quiet grace he'd shown all along, his voice steady, a calm that belied the storm of emotions within him. The SEAL team left as silently as they'd come, their mission complete, their boots echoing softly on the pavement as they disappeared into the fog, a ghost of justice that left Tony forever changed. Word spread through Bayview like wildfire. The Rusty Anchor was now the most vet-friendly bar in town, a place where heroes were welcomed, not shunned. A week later, Danny returned at Hawk's urging, his steps slow but steady as he walked through the door, the familiar scent of fried fish and stale beer greeting him like an old friend. Tony served him a lager with shaky hands, his eyes downcast, a man who'd learned his lesson the hard way. And even Bruno offered a respectful nod, his usual smirk replaced by something akin to awe. Danny sipped his drink, the cold lager a balm to the wounds of the past, a faint smile playing on his lips as he felt the presence of his brothers, a bond that distance and time could never break. This story isn't just about a bar. It's about courage, loyalty, and the resilience of those who serve, a testament to the power of brotherhood in a world that often forgets its heroes. Danny's journey reminds us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they're the quiet ones in the corner, carrying burdens we'll never see, their strength a silent force that shapes the world around them. It's a call to honor the veterans among us, to see their sacrifices, to stand against injustice with the same unity the SEALs showed, a unity that can move mountains, that can change hearts. Take a moment to reflect. Do you know a veteran whose story deserves to be heard? Share their name in the comments, along with a word of gratitude for their service, a small act of recognition that can mean the world. Let's build a community that celebrates these heroes and the love we have for our country, a community that ensures their sacrifices are never forgotten. The Rusty Anchor's transformation became a legend among the SEALs, a testament to the power of brotherhood, a story whispered in barracks and bars, a reminder of what it means to stand together. At Daily Narrated Stories, we're committed to sharing these life-changing tales that inspire and uplift, stories that remind us of the best in humanity, the strength that lies in unity, in loyalty, in love. Let's keep this momentum going. Help us grow this community of story lovers, a place where every tale finds a home. If you believe in the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood and the quiet strength of true heroes, don't wait. Subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories right now. We're racing toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support will help us share more stories that matter, stories that touch the heart and soul. Hit that button, comment loyalty to join the movement, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Time's ticking. Be part of this journey today, and let's honor the heroes who've given us so much together.